and we review the demographics and we look and say, oh my goodness, we're missing a lot of, we don't have seniors. I mean, or we don't have people between the ages of 35 and 45. Maybe they needed childcare because they have young kids. Or we don't have young people. Well, maybe we didn't make it interesting enough.
Ever wonder how local and state governments can dial into real engagement beyond just sifting through millions of mood ring type metrics from their constituents? Well, you'll want to stay tuned.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
You're not Buzz Lightyear.
I'm Siri.
And I'm Google.
And I am Alexa.
Alexa seems so smart, I think we'd have a lot to talk about.
Pew, pew.
From governing and government technology, this is The Future in Context. I'm Ashley Silver. Author and academic Fern Tiger's book entitled Creative Instigation gives readers a glimpse into a new future, one that replaces survey snapshots and reveals the true pulse of what communities see and need. I sat down for an interview with Fern, and she's sharing insightful strategies for diving into a new era of meaningful engagement, one that strengthens the relationships between residents and government agencies. Can you tell us what initially inspired you to write Creative Instigation and what you wanted readers to take away from the book?
Good question. First, I should say that this book is 20 years in the making. I started it many years ago. I was encouraged to do so by a lot of people, but I was always a little confused as to what should be the focus of the book. Should it be about the work of our firm? Should it be a more theoretical book about talking about what is this thing about engagement and how do you do it? I didn't want it to be a how-to book because I believe this work is extremely nuanced and needs to be really thought through for each project. It's not a cookie-cutter kind of thing. I wanted to be able to go deeply into a limited number of case studies. And I chose to do 6. And I also chose to have 4 that were done by our firm, and then selected 2 that I knew of that I very respected what they did. So I included them as well. So that made it less, not just our firm, but broader than that, and showed how different organizations had done it. But I think that in spite of the fact that I didn't want it to be a how-to, because I think it's so nuanced, there are certain broad strokes that cut across all of the projects. One is getting to know the community. One is how do you do the research? How do you get people to be involved, even if it's different in each community? There's some base level pieces of information that are important. So I realized I could handle that. And then I, as somebody who's been an academic, in addition to running a firm and doing projects, I had seen many students who were increasingly interested in community work, and even faculty. And the kinds of courses that were offered, in my opinion, were either too academic and didn't deal enough with on the ground and didn't bring enough of an understanding about this kind of on the ground work. Or else they were kind of too immersive, putting students into situations that they really weren't prepared for. And I could cite numerous examples. And then the books and publications that have been done seem to me that they didn't really push students or push even community members or government or other institutions to think about the kind of issues you need to think about when doing this kind of work. And at the same time, communities have been pushing more and more institutions and governments to have a greater voice. They want to have a say. They don't want to come in at the last minute. They don't want to just come to a city council meeting. They want to have more than that. So I think city and county staff and other governments and big institution staff are frustrated. They don't really feel they know how to do this work. It's kind of not something they were trained in. So all of these factors together.
When we're kind of breaking down the phrase creative instigation, I looked a little into it. And in the book, it says a term that is used throughout the book, of course, but it describes engagement that is authentic, outreach that is innovative and effective, research to uncover the soul of a community or an organization, and also strategies that are insightful. So in the government context, since we are government technology centered, what would that mean for government agencies that wanted to surface, how they could make their constituents' lives easier? What would they need to first do in order to know or uncover their needs to bring forth solutions or enhancements?
That's a great question. And I've had to think about it a lot, I think, in the course of doing the work we do. I think one of the things which is going to maybe come out sounding very basic, but I think governments are very used to issuing, well, firstly, I think governments have to come to the understanding of whether or not they can actually do this work themselves. Do they have the skills to do it? And I think government staff have to do so many different things that this is a very particular thing. You're not going to probably have somebody in-house, or it's unlikely that you're going to have someone in-house who can do this in the breadth and depth that I think I talk about in the book. So that said, I think a very important thing for government is my advice would be not to issue RFPs, but to issue RFQs. I assume your listeners probably know those terms, but requests for proposals means that the government or the institution has already laid out, this is what we want you to do. And it included in this would be, there should be 4 meetings and there would be, 12 interviews or whatever. Well, I don't think that's a good way to do it. If you do an RFQ or request for qualifications, you're going to find out about the different firms or the different individuals who do this kind of work, what their philosophy is, what their approach would be, how they would deal with outreach, how would they deal with running any kinds of sessions. And when you have the RFP, you're asking these professionals to sort of contort themselves to fit this model that you've pre-decided. I also often felt when I was teaching that many of my students were going to go on to government work. And I felt that if I could just get them to know how to write a really good RFQ and convince their superiors that RFPs are not a good way to go, I think I will have done my job. Because you can't expect people to be able to do so many different things. This is very transdisciplinary work. That would be what I would suggest firstly. Secondly, I think that once communities and governments have observed this kind of work, they can perhaps take on some of it, but they're not set up in many ways. For example, the kind of time it takes, being available morning, evening, weekends, that doesn't usually fit within the schedule of government, and that's when people are available.
That's a really good point, because we've done entire magazine articles where we basically ask government officials, what do you want to see from vendors? And I've absolutely never heard that, the request for qualifications rather than proposals. So one portion of the book mentions, what is required is a creative re-envisioning of the relationships and potential for productive communication between institutions and communities. Instead of kind of following those same rules, using the same tools, really authentic engagement and creative instigation can kind of shake things up and invent new rules and new tools along the way. So you mentioned how some tools for gauging public interest may not really be getting to the heart of community concerns. And those could include what we actually see pretty often, which is polling, surveys, focus groups. And you also mentioned info engagement, which of course is the collision between media, tech, and engagement that can fall kind of short of meaningful public involvement.
All right, I'm going to really give you the kind of rich information you need from a community. Firstly, they reflect like one moment in time. If I've had a bad mood and I sign on to do the survey or whatever, I just might say everything's terrible. If I'm in a good mood, I might say everything's great. But tomorrow, if you ask me, I might give you very different answers. That's first. Those kinds of things don't really challenge a community to think deeply about why it is that they feel the way they feel about something. It also doesn't allow them a chance to be sitting there with some neighbors or friends or colleagues and hear what they have to say and say, that's actually a kind of a good idea. I hadn't thought about it, or that I didn't realize this could work that way. To my mind, the alternative is this sort of thing I call authentic engagement, which is really making sure that you're gathering together and giving a chance to the broadest possible base of the community and making special effort to reach out to those parts of the community that we might call marginalized, people less likely to participate. Most of the time we find that they're not participating because they don't want to. Either they feel inadequate, that this is a topic I don't really understand very well, or the time to participate doesn't work with their work schedule, or they need childcare, or, people have lives and those lives are complicated. So making sure that you're doing the outreach it takes to really get people to come in. In many situations, we are in real time tracking the demographics of who is participating, because we tend to do small group participation, and we review the demographics and we look and say, oh my goodness, we're missing a lot of, we don't have seniors. I mean, or we don't have people between the ages of 35 and 45. Maybe they needed childcare because they have young kids. Or we don't have young people. Well, maybe we didn't make it interesting enough. So we're constantly adjusting and reaching out to those parts of the population that were not participating yet. So it's not a one-shot deal, and it's not like, and I think maybe I can add this, governments often do, well, we'll have a meeting and anybody who wants to can come. Maybe we'll even have 2 or 3 meetings. And then they either have a speaker, and maybe you can ask some questions, or you can make some comments at the microphone. You have no control over how many people are going to come. It might be very few. It could be huge. Similarly, if you just say, well, we'll have a Zoom meeting and everybody could sign on. That's the more contemporary way of doing it. I heard of a situation recently where 1,200 people signed on and were on this, all these little faces on the screen. Well, what was that? They were more angry than they were productive. That's not authentic engagement. Maybe a community, a city has a meeting and they set up some sort of participatory part of a session, and they think, oh, great, we really made people participate, and maybe people even enjoyed it. But if you look at that, who came? And if you don't have a representative group that looks like your population, I don't think that's authentic engagement either. So to do authentic engagement, as you gave the definition earlier, really means knowing how to bring these people to the table, knowing how to set it up so that it's appropriate for them. And I'll give an example. In a project that's in the book called Focus Maui Nui in Maui County, Hawaii, we did a lot of research there to figure out what does it take to get people to participate. And we found out that people who really live in Maui, not people who come and visit or have part-time houses there, but the people whose livelihoods are dependent on the Maui economy, they don't really like to speak out at big public meetings. It's not that they're shy, and it's not that they're not opinionated, but these are small communities. So they see the person the next day, probably at the supermarket, and they don't really want to offend anybody. Let's say that. So there have been problems in getting people out. On the other hand, those people who've moved to Maui from Boston and New York and Chicago, they go to all those community meetings. They have a lot to say, but they're not the people who really, really have a history in Maui. So we realized that we needed to do this in a way where there were going to be no more than 10 people at each session. That's a lot of sessions then if you want to get a lot of people. We also decided, because of this piece of information, that we would not we were working with a nonprofit organization. They would not go out and try to recruit participants. They would recruit hosts. Then the host could invite the people, the 10 people, to their house or meet at the community center or wherever. But they would invite their friends, their family, their colleagues, so they were comfortable having this conversation. Whereas if they were thrown into a group randomly, they might not really express their point of view. We also used the fact that they have a history in Hawaii called Talk Story, which is sort of like chatting with one person and then another person, a little bit like we used to play telephone as a kid, and everyone told everything to the next person. We had elected officials go door to door and do Talk Story, especially in the communities that were less likely to participate. They knocked on their doors, they had a little chat, and they said, there's going to be these sessions, and would you like to sign up to be a host? And people were really excited by the fact that someone actually came to their door. It was respectful. It showed that they really wanted them to participate.
What were some of the most significant challenges or kind of common threads, common challenges that you were seeing that these communities faced in their engagement efforts, and how were they able to overcome those?
That's a great question. And I'd say each community or each institution had different challenges. For the most part, they all faced financial challenges. How do you pay for this? It's not sort of, budgeted here or budgeted there, although sometimes a city or a government, has something there that they already knew in advance the year before they wanted to do. So there's a line item for it. Foundations, the nonprofits, depend a lot on foundation funding, on philanthropy. And for the most part, foundations are not very big on funding this kind of stuff. I don't know why. I think they should, but they don't. And if it is, it's usually underfunded because people don't realize how much it takes to do it well. So they might say, "Oh, we're going to fund engagement," and and all it would do, probably the money that's given is, I don't know, maybe get some posters out there or something, but not enough for what has to be done. So I think funding is a big challenge.
And also, your book emphasizes the importance of understanding the history and the context of each community, which I think is really, really important. But can you kind of explain how vital this is to the success of community engagement efforts?
Understanding the pulse of the community is what I would say. Its vibes, its pulse, is essential to this kind of work. Firstly, you want to make it appropriate for that community. So like I said about having the Maui project at people's houses or wherever they decided they wanted to host it. Well, in Albany, when we were doing the waterfront, there had been a developer there about 4 years prior. And in his effort to gain the support of the community, he was funding it all by himself, he managed to convince some people to invite people to their homes for coffees, they called it, so he could present his plan. Well, people were very angry about his plan, and plan never went through. So the last thing we were going to do was do it at people's houses, because they would think back and say, "Oh, must be like that thing that developer did." So instead, we did the Albany sessions only in public spaces, in schools, in libraries, in community centers. We didn't do anything in anybody's house. So had we not understood the history of what had happened, in previous efforts, we might have just said, "Oh, it'd be great to do it at people's houses."
What's next? What's next for Fern? Are there any upcoming projects or areas? I know that this hasn't actually settled yet, but are there any upcoming projects or areas of focus that you're excited about? And
Well, actually, I'm working on 2 projects in Maui again that are still building 20 years later on that project that focused Maui Nui, because they haven't forgotten it and they keep doing things that tie into it. So we're actually looking again at the organization that sponsored it, Maui Economic Development Board, METB. And we're looking with them at what their future is now. We're now talking, since that, let's see, that was like in 2002. So we're talking like 22 years later. They're a much bigger organization now. They're involved in a lot of different things, heavily involved in education, STEM education, and bringing technology to young people so they can do the jobs that are emerging. So we're back working with them, thinking about their future developing a set of strategies for them. And that's complex, and we're doing it the same way. We're back interviewing people again. Now it's younger people and some of the same people we interviewed before, but what's changed, etc. And we're doing another publication for them that deals with the trends that have occurred over time there. And I would say then most important is I'm trying to, do all the things that I didn't get to do when I was writing the book. So I'm trying to backtrack on a couple of things.
Well, can you tell our listeners, I guess, how they can engage with you or connect with you if they want to follow your projects or learn more?
I'm more than happy to give my email address, and I'm very good at responding. Basically, fern@ferntiger.com, and they're welcome to reach out with any additional questions or comments, suggestions, or whatever they might be interested in.
Well, this has been great. A lot of really good information, and I think a lot of opportunities to, one, definitely learn about a great novel or book that they can purchase, but then also how to, I guess, gain that core engagement that's really in depth between communities and the public and private sector leaders. So I do thank you once again, Fern, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Ashley. They were great questions. You're a very good interviewer. And I do a lot of it, so I know.
Thank you. So that'll do it for this episode of The Future in Context. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and make sure to like and subscribe to catch a new episode. Bye for now.
Bye.